Today we have Peter giving us a talk about encoding models in fMRI. And just before I start, I should say that Peter has just got a job at Cambridge, a permanent job, so he's leaving us. So we're just taking this opportunity to download his brain before he goes. So also we should take this opportunity to congratulate him. And over to you, Peter.
Oh, I'll just wait for Chris to come in. So basically today I'll be talking about encoding models in fMRI, and this is something I've actually never done. So it will be a bit interesting, and I also finished the presentation just 40 minutes ago. But anyway, it's something that I wanted to do a bit like the old CISC style methods, where it's aimed for people that have never heard of this thing, mainly PhD students, and introduce it, and potentially for PIs to give a general overview of why you might ever use that. However, you see also by the end of the talk why I haven't done it before. So a brief overview is that I'll give like a very high-level introduction to encoding models, how they're different from decoding models, and I'll explain a bit what decoding models are as well, and then just give like 2 practical examples and a bit more of the general methods that you have to care about when you try to fit, well, basically encoding or decoding models, or effectively any statistical methods. So encoding models in general are basically something that we do all the time, especially in fMRI, which is like we fit a design matrix to our brain data. So our design matrix, for example, is the stimuli that we choose. So in this very simple example, the person might have been shown a happy face and a sad face, and we might have like one regressor that says, when was the picture of the happy face presented, when was the picture of the sad face presented, is a different regressor. So basically, we try to model the brain activity based on some design matrix that says when the condition occurred. And here we have, in this particular example, focused on just 2 faces, so happy faces, sad faces, and these are the experimental conditions that we care about. So the typical experimental approach, which is very much oversimplified here with just happy and sad faces, is that we control these experimental stimuli by trying to match them and reduce their variability as much as possible. So for example, always present the same happy face, always present the same sad face. And whenever we fit the GRM model, so a regression, we might have like this voxel responds more to the happy faces compared to the sad faces. So that tells us something, that this particular voxel that provides a high beta value, for example, cares about the distinction between happy and sad faces. However, the problem is we don't really know what it cares about these happy and sad faces. So we don't know what this region is representing in terms of the information. Is it the case that it actually captures the emotional difference between happy and sad face that we normally think of in psychological research? Or is it the case that this is capturing something specific about the stimulus, such as like this voxel really likes this type of shape, such as like a inverted U, and this one really, dislikes the inverted U compared to the normal U shape. So this is basically just the typical experimental approach for encoding models, which can make it difficult to compare across models because different people would use different stimuli, and it may make it difficult to understand what is actually represented within a particular brain area. So for example, we might design a second experiment to test whether the voxel cares just about the inverted U shapes by presenting it specific stimuli that are with basically all smiling but showing different types of emotions. For the people that don't know, that's Jack Nicholson in The Shining when he's just about to attack his family. So although he's smiling, it's not a positive emotion. That's Brad Pitt smiling at the red carpet. So yes, we can basically create further experimental designs to address these types of questions, but with a single experiment, it may be a bit more difficult. So that's why some people have started arguing of using more naturalistic and more complex stimuli within a single experimental session to try to address better what information is represented in the brain. So this is about the typical univariate encoding models. I'll just now give a brief introduction to the decoding models, which basically is, the idea is that, okay, with the encoding models, we fit a separate regression to each voxel independently. So we don't we don't capture the information that is shared across pattern of voxels, a pattern of activity. So, for example, here, if we have voxel 1 or a voltage channel in a EEG, if we collapse all these data points, so for example, you can imagine the blue is the happy faces and the red is the sad faces. If we just collapse it on a single channel, we can see that they overlap very much. Similarly, if we look at channel 2, which could be voxel 2 or like EEG channel 2, we again see that they overlap very much. So basically, this is what the simple encoding model and regression tries to do is you're looking at these types of overlapping distributions and you're trying to separate them somehow, based on, for example, mean activity. For example, you're trying to say, is the blue distribution's mean activity higher than the red? And in this particular example, it is slightly higher, but you can see that there is a lot of overlap. What the representing the data in multidimensional spaces can try to address is that there might be some variance that is captured between, covariance between the voxel 1 and voxel 2, or the channels, that we can capture by representing the data in this multidimensional space, where each stimulus presentation now is put in a coordinate system where the activity of voltage 1, channel 1 and channel 2 are its coordinates. And in this representation, we can try to fit, for example, a new model that tries to distinguish the classes. And it can be a bit more sensitive or better at capturing this. So a bit more concrete example is that in normal univariate models, we tend to average across a region, for example, and we might say, is this region univariately responding more to particular conditions, such as happy faces or sad faces. So here I have shown, where's my mouse? So D1 is voxel 1, and we have, like, for example, stimulus 1 is cognitive state A. So we have that voxel 1 responds high, voxel 2 responds low, and voxel 3 responds high. But this is a different combination for cognitive state B, where voxel 1 responds low, voxel 2 high, voxel 3 high, and so on. So basically, by looking at the pattern across these voxels, we are effectively putting the stimuli, or the cognitive states that we're interested in this multidimensional space, rather than averaging across all the voxels. And this can basically a bit more sensitive, because, for example, this voxel might distinguish between cognitive state A and C, between A and C together versus B. This one distinguishes A from B and C, and so on. But when we put all the stimuli in a multidimensional space, we can try to better distinguish the three cognitive states. So this is the main idea of the decoding models, is that basically it turns the question around, because we want to, instead of predict the brain activity based on our conditions, we use the brain activity to predict our design matrix. So we are using the brain activity to predict the conditions. So for example, we have the cognitive state A. This is the axis that's in the multidimensional space, so each voxel or channel is a new axis, and we put the stimuli in these multidimensional spaces, and we fit the decoding models that can now a bit more easily distinguish between the conditions. So basically, the main difference between encoding and decoding models is the direction of the mapping that we are doing. So we might be doing from brain activity predicted by design matrix in encoding models, but in decoding, we predict design matrix from the brain activity. And although this method is a bit more sensitive, it effectively, again, has the same problem that we might be able to distinguish between happy and sad faces in a particular region, but we still don't know exactly what information is represented in that region. So going back to the Jack Nichols example, it might be the case that our decoding model really captures the information that is we care about, such as this is a negative emotional state, and this is a positive emotional state. But it also is the case that we basically don't know what the decoder is using to do the classification accurately. It might also be the case that it just does, well, Jack Nicholson is looking at the camera, Brad Pitt is not looking at the camera, and this is the feature that is basing the classification on. And it could be, as you can see, 100% accurate based on this type of stimuli. So the main idea behind some proponents of more, let's say, complicated encoding models is that instead of trying to fit tight experimental designs where we use very discrete feature spaces, we can use a bit more naturalistic stimuli and then build an encoding model that is a bit more complicated and try to understand what information is represented in a particular brain region. So, for example, here the encoding model might be this bit, where from a specific feature space, we're doing the linear mapping, which is basically the linear regression, and we're trying to predict the brain activity. However, this feature space is effectively some fancy, or if you want, nonlinear representation of the stimuli. So, for example, the stimuli might be some natural images. We can represent them as pixel values, so there might be like thousands of pixel values. But instead of using the pixel values, we might use some type of nonlinear feature mapping to represent them in this feature space, which, by the way, is exactly the same thing we do when we say, well, these are happy faces and these are sad faces or whatever. We're just using a bit more quantitatively designed feature space more often than not. And then we use this feature space to predict the brain activity using a linear regression. And effectively, how we choose this feature space is the real magic. And it's the thing that I'm not going to cover super much here because it really depends on the type of question you're interested in addressing. For example, if you like these types of more complicated encoding models are very, very popular in sensory neuroscience, where, for example, you might try to predict the brain response to specific images based on a model that has the receptive fields of each neuron or each voxel, or, for example, by using some Gabor patches and like different types of information, such as features that we might be interested in, and that often is basically built on previous research. So a different example might be, instead of using sensory example, might be to use semantic memory. So, for example, if we want to predict the brain response to a new word, we might basically have a feature space that is, in some sense, capturing something very important about semantic memory. So this might be, for example, if you have like a dictionary of all the words, this might be your semantic memory, and you can use that as a feature space. Now go into a bit more detail how, for example, this type of feature space can be created. Just to show one example how feature spaces can be created, and is that basically we can have multiple measures of something, whatever we are interested in, for each specific stimulus. So, for example, instead of presenting the pixel values in these images, we might know the personality scores of these people. And that way we can represent now the people as lying in this, again, multi-dimensional space, but for the stimuli and not for the brain activity. So we can put the people as like having one axis is extroversion, so we can see that basically Jack Nicholson and Brad Pitt are equally extroverted. However, negative emotionality, they differ, and then on agreeableness, they differ. So this type of embedding can be done for any kind of stimuli, and it's basically can be chosen by you. What are the axes of the dimensions that you want to represent? And these are the things that you might be interested in. So for example, if we fit an encoding model using these types of 3 personality scores, we can say, well, actually, negative emotionality predicts the brain activity very well in the amygdala, whereas agreeableness predicts it very well in the hippocampus, or something like that. So these types of embeddings can be particularly useful. And I'll here show the example of word embeddings. So the idea is that words can be represented as a string of numbers in these multidimensional spaces. And the idea is that we try to create this multidimensional space such that similar words tend to be similar. So similar words tend to be close in this multidimensional space. So queen and woman might be a bit more similar than king and water, for example. And in that way, we can basically use these types of features. So each of these is a feature. So the extroversion will be a feature, negative emotionality will be a feature. This is exactly the same thing, just they're not named, but like you have different values, and each of these is a feature that represents the stimulus in a specific way. And that has been done by some researchers, but in like one of the most prominent examples was done with a slightly more simple semantic embedding that I'll just explain now. But their experiment effectively was something that we have seen multiple times. It's basically people were just presented with line drawings and then a word. So they see the picture of a dog and then the word dog, then airplane, then eye, and then hammer. And there's basically multiple of these semantic concepts that the participants are represented in the scanner in a slow event-related design. What was really smart out of these people was that they said, well, instead of trying to predict like the univariate responses, let's say for animals versus non-animals, they say, what if we try to build embedding of the words and then an encoding model based on this embedding? So here what I mean by embedding is that they say an embedding is, you have the word celery, for example. How much celery does co-occur with the 25 features? And these 25 features were, for example, action verbs, such as see, hear, taste, smell, etc. So we say celery occurs, you know, people usually see celery. So in, like, for example, so these co-occurrences are, for example, based on large texts on Wikipedia articles, and somebody has trained a model on linguistics, and basically there is celery occurs that many times with the word see. It occurs 0 times with the word hear, because people don't hear celery, but it occurs a lot with the word taste. So this is something that has been done, for example, by people doing engineering, and these people just take this model and embed the word celery with these 25 verbs. So they say how much celery occurs, how often does celery occur with each of these 25 verbs. And they do the same for each word that was presented in the experiment. And in a sense, basically now, instead of representing celery as a single thing that happened only once in the experiment, they represent celery as a combination of linear features, which are these 25 features, the 25 verbs. And they try to say, well, let's try to predict each voxel's brain response based on these 25 features by fitting a linear regression. So here, X, instead of being something like animals versus tools, which is like an indicator variable, one for animals, one for tools, the X is basically this feature matrix, or the word embedding, which is like the co-occurrence of each word with the 25 features. So we have x, which is 25 times the time points of y, and we basically fit the normal regression model that says how much does each feature, each of these semantic features, help us predict a particular voxel's response. So they did that, and this is how that might look. For example, if you're trying to predict the word celery, we say that we have some beta value. This is what the encoding model estimates. What we do have is the embedding of eat, house, and field. These are the 25 features. So for each feature, we have basically a brain map that says the brain map is like showing the beta values after we fit the model. And it's like the word celery is how much is this celery, a linear combination of each of these 25 features. So how much is celery predicted by eat, taste, and feel. And basically, based on this linear combination of these 25 features, we try to predict the brain activity that we would have observed when we see the new word celery. And here, a very important point is that whereas normally we try to predict a model and then we get like a t-statistic that says, okay, this hypothesis was significant or not. With these types of models, what you often want to do is predict stimulus that is out of sample, or like you try to predict the brain activity for something that the model hasn't been trained on, which is also the same for decoding models. So basically here, our model that was trained on all the words apart from celery, for example, predicts this type of brain activation for the word celery. But then we actually have the observed brain map for celery, and we can say, is this basically similar? Is there a correlation between the predicted brain map and the observed brain map? And we basically do that for each of the words sequentially in the model. And if our predicted values are very correlated with the observed values, then we can say, well, the model is capturing something informative, something useful. Because if we can predict celery based on a linear combination of ratings on these 25 verbs, that suggests that this is some type of information about these verbs is capturing how celery is represented in the brain. And also, we can map which voxels basically code for these types of semantic information. And the usefulness of these encoding models is that, okay, these voxels light up, but now we can say, well, these voxels light up based on our, let's say, semantic model, based on these 25 verbs, action verbs. But we can also build an encoding model that is based on some of the visual representation of the line drawings, such as like the edges, like are the voxels also responding to the visual aspects of the words? And we can try to fit this type of visual feature model and see, is it the case that the same voxels respond to that, or we can literally directly compare the models for this type of brain region. Is it the case that the visual model or the semantic model leads to better predictions? So basically more closer to the actual response. So that is the true benefit of the encoding models, is that you can build different models, for example, some on semantics, some on visual, some on emotional features, and you can try to argue, well, if the visual features are not fitting in this area, but the semantic features are fitting in this area, then this area must be coding something about the semantic aspects of the stimuli. And this can also be further explored to try to examine the importance of each individual feature. So for example, we can see that here, for the feature verb eat, this is the spatial brain map. And we can see that basically this region is close to the olfactory areas. It likes to respond to words that are associated with the verb eat. Whereas for push, it's a different region. And for run, it's a third region. So that way we can try to say which voxels code for which type of features that we might be interested in. In this particular case, you often have to basically compare your model to something. So why did the authors choose these 25 verbs rather than some other semantic embedding? Well, they tried to do other semantic embeddings where they tried to map celery to the occurrence of other words such as car, house, apartment. But they show that basically these 25 verbs provide the most accurate features to predict the brain data. So their argument is that these 25 verbs provide better representation of what is in the brain for these semantic words than compared to some other embedding of the words. And here is another example that is basically similar, very, very similar. But instead of using 25 features, they use only 5 features, which are basically participants provided ratings for each of the words on how much they feel that the feature sound is associated with dog, how much the feature color is associated with dog, and so on. So they have these 5 ratings for each word, and these are the 5 features that they are interested in. And they're all sensory motor features. And they use these features exactly the same way to predict the brain activity for different words. So we can see again that like for sound, these voxels really like to respond to the sound features, these to the colors, these to motion, these to shape, and so on. However, what was interesting based on that study is that using only these 5 features of the words, they could predict relatively accurately the new words that have not been observed. And they could do that in areas that are often associated with a model semantic representation. So their argument was that, well, if these regions are supposed to be a model, then why can we predict them with features based on sensory attributes such as sound, smell, and shape, and motion? So their argument is that basically, well, if our model fits so well, then it must be the case that these heteromodal areas might also be not really a model and be representing sensory motor attributes of these concepts. So which is quite a big claim for semantic memory, because there have been suggestions that like there's specific regions that are a model and not linked to any attributes of the words. However, this encoding modeling argues against that. Do remember this result, because I'll come back to it later on. So when we use these types of like our handmade features, we don't really need to do very much apart from just fit a normal linear regression. But coming back to the idea of using naturalistic stimuli, let's say we present some normal stories to our participants. So like, for example, they're listening podcasts on something. Then it can become quite difficult what features to use. And one example might be that we use each word as a separate feature. So this is like each word, we have an indicator variable. You know, the word cat happened 20 seconds in. The word dog happened 40 seconds into the story. So we have like literally a separate regressor for each word. And if we have 2,700 words, we have 2,700 regressors. However, we have 3,700 time points. So this type of thing starts to become quite easily over-parameterized. So where we have too many regressors for the number of data points that we have. And The examples I've shown before, they pre-processed data in a way that basically they didn't have to fit the canonical HRF. But when you have a naturalistic stimuli, for example, you might want to account for the hemodynamic lag to actually be able to predict the brain data well. So, for example, this can be done just like in SPM or FSL by multiplying each of our regressors by some basis functions. Or it can be done, in this particular example, they did an FIR model, which is basically if I have the feature for cat, which says that the cat word occurred 20 seconds in. I also now create a feature for cat that occurred 22 seconds in, then cat occurred 24 seconds in, and then 20 seconds in. So basically, I just concatenate all the features slightly delayed in time. And then basically I can model the HRF by myself by using the FIR model. So that basically I know that the bold response for cat 20 seconds in was like 0.5, but 24 seconds was 0.8, and so on. So you can model your own HRF using that. And just basically you can imagine that if you try to lag 2000 stimuli, 2000 regressors, it becomes that you start to have quite a lot of regressors. So you have now about 10,000 regressors for about 4,000 time data points. So you really have a lot more predictors than data points, which can basically lead to overfitting, which I'll slightly brush over because I presume most people are aware of this problem. But overfitting is if this is a simple example where we have some data points. The blue is the data point. The green is the true function that created these data points, and the data points were just created with a bit of noise. So when we fit a very bad model that basically says, well, everything is just the average response, so we just collapse across all the data points, we have an underfitting problem where we're basically not predicting anything very well. If we increase the number of parameters, we can start to get a better prediction where it's aligned, but it's still not really predicting very well. At some point, we're going to get the number of parameters that are very correctly describing this underlying function. In this particular case, it's a cubic function, so 3 parameters are describing the underlying distribution. But we don't know the underlying distribution. So often what we might do is try to fit a model that is more complex, but then this would overfit where the red line is the fitted line, and you can see that it fits each dot perfectly, but it's very wiggly. So it is very wiggly, which basically means that if now we have a new blue point here, our model is not going to be predicting it very well. Or if we have a blue point here, you can see that this is way away from the actually predicted thing from this model. So this is something that is incredibly common and happens when you have too many parameters with too little data. You can try to fix that by having more data, or you can try to address that by using regularization, which is basically a fancy way to make your model, if it is like this, to look a bit more like this. Basically, regularization is making the model a bit simpler. Again, here, one of the main ways that this can be detected is by using prediction and not statistical inference. Because in this model here, your t-values are going to be quite high because effectively you've modeled all the data perfectly. So you have no noise, so you have like perfect values, and your t-stats would be very high. However, what you want to know is that to make sure that you're not overfitting is that you try to predict a new data point that comes supposedly from the underlying distribution, but is also potentially going to have some small noise and be away from the red line, because potentially the red line is really fitting the noise in this specific data set. So what was done in the previous example when you have 4,000 data points and 10,000 regressors is, rather than fit the normal regression that we know, is to try to fit a regularization parameter, which effectively is, you can see that everything is exactly the same up to this point. And then you just add something, which is basically the weight squared. That basically effectively says, well, if I'm trying to minimize this, here we're trying to minimize this, so beta could be quite high, so that it matches the y as much as possible to minimize the error. But here it's exactly the same thing, we're minimizing this error. However, now we also have to minimize this regularization term, which is saying that, well, beta can't be too high, because if beta is too high, then this whole equation would be dominated by the betas, and therefore we wouldn't be minimizing it so well. So effectively, you don't really need to know the maths behind that. It's just that there are ways to address these types of problems by, for example, it's almost as if you're putting a prior on your regression model, where you're saying, well, the normal regression doesn't have any prior for the beta weights, so they can be as high as possible. But with the rich regression, I can say, well, I know that I want to say that my beta weights should be somewhere around 0. They shouldn't be too high. So this is effectively the same thing as putting a prior on your beta weights and saying my beta weights shouldn't be too high, while still trying to fit this model. Which would basically mean that now the function that the model is fitting is by definition going to be a bit simpler than the function that an unregularized model would be fitting. And this is the normal rich regression. Basically, there are multiple packages in Python and MATLAB where you just type rich regression, fit, and you're done. So you don't really need to know the maths, it's just like an example. The explanation behind this is that also this type of regularization can help a lot with the fitting, but there's also something that is missing from the normal rich regression, which is like in the normal rich regression, we say all the weights should be around 0, but they're uncorrelated with each other. So for example, the response, the beta map from the image statistic map of the brain activation for cat is not related for the image map for the word dog. So the model then doesn't understand that the beta weights should somehow be correlated. Slight generalization, basically rich regression is a specific case of Tikhonov regression, which is basically almost exactly the same thing as rich regression. It's just that if here we say that the weights are identically distributed, so they're not correlated. In Tikhonov regression, we say that they're distributed based on some covariance matrix. So we can, with Tikhonov regression, we can say, well, you know what? Cats and dogs are kind of the same thing, so they should be correlated with each other, and their brain response should be correlated. So basically, you're putting an additional prior on your regression, where you're saying, well, my regression weights should be small, so they should be centered around 0 with some distribution, but they should be also correlated in a specific way. And this specific way is a prior that basically we put as the researchers. And a neat thing about these types of regressions is that, again, you don't really need to know exactly how it's fit, because what you can do is you can transform your stimuli into this embedding space. So, and in this embedding space, you can say that the embedding space is capturing some of the covariance that you are interested in. So for example, if we try to embed the words cat and dog into some space where they're similar, instead of fitting the regressors that are like cat occurred 20 seconds in, dog occurred 40 seconds in, we can embed these words into these features, just like we had the see here verbs. into a specific space, and then fit the normal ridge regression. And because they're now already in the embedding space, the ridge regression is basically using this prior that is the, well, basically similarity between words that are in the embedding space. So basically it is using the covariance of the words that are, we know that should be similar, are now being told to be similar. And this doesn't have to be with words. The general procedure is that if this is the covariance matrix that is the prior for the beta weights, we can take the square root of this matrix and pre-multiply our stimuli by this matrix, and then just fit the normal ridge regression, which would basically be as if you're fitting a Tikhonov regression. And by providing these priors for the words, you can basically, well, basically Alex has shown very well that you can really increase your predictability for the brain responses for specific words. Because effectively, well, you know that cats and dogs are similar, and you're telling that to your model. So now your model has to do something much easier than if it has to figure out from the brain responses itself that cats and dogs should be similar, but airplanes and dogs are not similar. Basically, there are packages to run these types of models. So again, you don't really need to know the math, but if you try to do encoding models, probably you should brush up on like different types of regression models and how to regularize them and fit them. Although there are multiple packages, so you don't really need to know much of the math. So these are the results of this particular paper that used the Tikhonov regression. And what is cool is that now they can say, well, these voxels here around the angular gyrus are coding something about the words, which is basically the social features of the words. These yellow ones and green ones are something coding semantic features about body parts. The green ones are visual, and so on and so on. Basically, you can create a map where each voxel is saying, well, I really like the social features or these type of words. I really like dogs and cats, and well, dogs and cats are not necessarily social, but something social. So the idea is that by using this, then you can try to basically map what information is represented by the voxels. So, do people have any questions? Yeah, Sam.
So in that Tikhonov regression, regularization with the covariance matrix, the word embeddings, those word embeddings aren't used in they're not used in the main regression, the linear regression analysis. They are.
Yeah. So what you do is you literally, instead of fitting the normal words, you embed them into this space, just like with the first example. And then you fit these features with the ridge regression, and then that basically simplifies to the Tikhonov regression.
And so the covariance matrix that you use for the regularization, that's the covariance of the embeddings.
Yeah. So the covariance matrix is what you're pre-multiplying your stimulus, which is the like from word. You know, you have the word onset, word embedding. This is basically the square root of this covariance matrix. So the covariance matrix then is the embedding bit. Because you pre-multiply your words by the matrix that is the square root of the covariance matrix that basically transforms the words. So if I have words onset, it transforms the words into the embeddings, and now I have the onsets for the embedding vectors. And basically the main reason one might do that is because we already have the embedding matrix. Like you can go to a neural network that has been trained to do like natural language processing, get this matrix that does the embedding, for you, and then you don't have to do try to figure out how to put this covariance matrix as the prior. So it's basically a simplification of a basically slightly hacky way to fit a Tikhonov regression. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have to put any different kind of spatial or regularization or kind of temporal regularization in different lags? Because it's still quite over-parameterized, right?
So in this particular example, they I believe they didn't use the temporal lag regularization, but it is the case that you can put spatial and temporal priors, but they haven't done that in this example. But often, like that guy has a YouTube tutorial, and there he said that basically when he tried these types of things, where like by spatial prior is, for example, you're saying that boxes within that are close to each other should also have some type of similar response, or by temporal is like boxes that are close, responses that are close in time should be similar. So when he tried these things, they didn't really improve the model, but it's probably the case that with more data and more things, that these types of regularization will become a bit more standard.
Did they do an increased smoothing in order to encourage spatial regularization? Because the images look quite smooth. I mean, I guess the data is naturally correlated, but yeah, makes the fitting easier if you add regularization normally.
Yeah. I think that so this is like based on individual person's data. So I'm not sure whether like in surface space. So I'm not sure that they did smoothing, but it's quite possible they did some minimal smoothing. But as far as I remember, they didn't put the spatial and temporal regularizations. But yeah, that's what I meant. People should brush up on regression, because then you can put priors on a lot of things that can potentially help you fit the model. Yeah, Chris?
So this is just to check I've understood it. It's trying to predict single voxel responses rather than multivariate.
Yeah.
It's using multivariate thing to fit that. Could you get anything more by trying to fit multivariate responses?
You could, just that I'm not sure that it has worked for most people. So for example, you can use like MANOVA, where like you have multiple dependent variables, which are the different voxel responses, or partial least squares, or canonical correlation. But again, I haven't done it. From this person's YouTube tutorial, he said that they often didn't work necessarily that well. It is quite possible that the more complicated the model you fit, even with the regularizations and prior, you probably really need a lot more data.
Do you know if anyone's attempted to inform the nonlinear feature embedding with the brain data? So like going beyond like maybe the simple Gabor patches that are like kind of theoretically motivated. Has anyone like taken an image and said, okay, well we're going to apply some like convolution to it, but the details of that convolution are fit by the brain data, which has like a human aligned model beforehand. Because that seems really over-parameterized and over-powerful, but like I wonder whether anyone's even tried it.
I don't have a specific example. I mean, I presume you might have better luck finding something like that from the engineer field. Like sometimes you might, like as you say, try to do like almost like a encoder-decoder thing where the brain is the middle step. But I don't have a specific example of that. But what I can show afterwards is that basically you can potentially try to address these types of questions in a different way, which is like, I don't know how the receptor fields are, but like I have the brain data for Jack Nicholson, and I try to see is that brain data reactivated when I think about Jack Nicholson. So if you have like independent runs, for example, you might have in one task you show Jack Nicholson multiple times in the scanner. Then you have the task people remembering Jack Nicholson when he was in New York. And is it the case that then you can see basically the pattern for the Jack Nicholson being reinstated, which basically simplifies a lot because then it can be even a simple correlation. But I guess it's something similar to the method you want to do, just a bit more like specifying the features based on the brain data.
Yeah, or discovering the features from the brain data, I guess, because like maybe you don't know what emotions Jack Nicholson is making or how to even characterize them, but you have a systematic way to maybe predict what those would be, but you would like that prediction to be informed by the brain. I don't know. Yeah, it seems like it's probably like too much to do.
So you talked about like model selection, where you kind of you build a model that you think might be semantic, and you can also have a model that might be visual. Is there any reason not to always put everything you've got in, and then allow the regularization to decide which brain areas like which? Because the regularization should be amounting to feature selection, right? It's minimizing the features that are not important and allowing the ones that are important to give high beta weights. So should you not always throw every feature in you've got and then allow the regularization to tell you which brain region is doing what? Like, why would you ever, and I know people do this different model selection, but why would you ever do the model selection when you could throw everything into one model and then see what pops out?
I mean, the problem is that these models often have a lot of a lot of features. So even the regularization by itself can't deal with it. So basically, the model just wouldn't be able to predict the data, for example, or like out of sample. I would say that this is the main problem.
I think it depends on your goal. If your goal is to predict the neural response, then yeah, you could throw everything in. Maybe it makes the model very complex and hard to fix, but that's why you have the regularization. But if your goal is instead to test that hypothesis about how you think the brain works, or maybe the brain doesn't care about everything, it cares about certain things, likes food, for instance, as we've been finding out, but not more than certain color. And so it's just, yeah, for me, that's where the model comparison comes in. You're seeing which the model that's the best is the one that is telling you, what the brain likes and represents. It depends on your goal.
Yeah, exactly. And also the...
If you have features which are perfectly correlated, then you have an identifiability issue. So then having two features which give you the same information can really screw up model fitting. And L2 regularization like this isn't going to help with that. You need some kind of sparsity. Basically, you end up, if you add lots of features which are redundant, you end up having a much harder regularization problem. You maybe need to introduce just clever tricks to get rid of things.
Yeah, so the regularization is not super magic all the time.
There's variations like banded ridge regression, where you have the separate ridge parameter for each feature. So you're not assuming the same. I guess it's kind of like the taking off regression, but you're allowing more flexibility with how much you assume the weights to be small versus large. So the feature dependent on it.
I was just going to say in FSL the fitting uses a kind of basic model comparison, so you actually encourage a sparsity if there's no reason to assume that parameters are useful, just turn it on in your regression. So you can kind of solve some of these things using full Bayesian inference, but it becomes computationally very expensive.
That was kind of related to my question, like with these ridge parameters, what do people tend to people just pick one and set it? For instance, if you were just choosing the normal ridge regression. Okay.
So that leads me to my next slide. So as Sam pointed out, what people often do, that's the same for encoding and decoding models, is cross-validation. where you pick some of your data, you train the model on it, and then when you try to predict the new data and test it, that is where like this type of the held out data sits. And basically you can do that such as like if I have, I don't know, 5 parts of the data. By parts, I mean that could be individual runs or whatever you want, individual stories. You split the data in a specific way. Here it's like a 5 split. So first you train on parts 2 to 4 to 5 and test on 1, and then you go on so that you have always used part of the data set. What becomes quite problematic, and maybe Ed can address this, if you have a rich parameter for every single beta value, then how can you do the cross-validation? Because if you have a single hyperparameter, the rich regression, what you already have with the normal cross-validation is not enough. And what you have to do is like a nested cross-validation, where you first split your data into training and test data. Now you grab this test data and you further split it into the 5 folds, and you do the cross-validation on only this part of the data, where you can, for example, select, well, my rich parameter should be 50 rather than 1. And then after you've decided on your rich parameter 50, you then evaluate the final model on the test data. But the more of these, they're called hyperparameters, the rich parameters or like regularization parameters, the more you have, the more you kind of have to cross-validate. And it can make it more difficult for the, like how much data you have.
When I've done this before, I've done the very simplest thing, but justifying it on the basis that I was more interested in how the model accuracies differ between conditions, experimental conditions. So all the estimates are probably a bit off and biased, but that procedure was done the same way for all the conditions. And so it was on to me that the difference between conditions that were interested in. So yeah, I mean, but I didn't do it a more complex way.
I mean, as Ed said, like basically, if you care about comparison cross condition, or like what you were asking, you can pick one, let's say 50, because 50 sounds nice, and like go with it. And if you're doing like a comparison across for a specific hypothesis, it would be perfectly fine. If you really want to improve your prediction accuracy, then you kind of need to do that. Or
I'd like to make a statement in opposition of that, just because if you pick a particular regularization parameter, you are introducing bias.
That's not what I meant actually. We did use cross-validation to find the rich parameter, so I didn't pick up some random value. But I think that's what I took away from this slide, is that you need kind of this nested cross-validation, so that you have a period where you're finding the best rich parameter, and then you reserve other data to actually then do the final test of the model and get the final model accuracies. And so I didn't do the latter, I did the former. So it wasn't a random rich parameter. So we're using cross-validation, but it wasn't a very sophisticated partitioning. So I think that all the individual model accuracies are biased, but it was the difference in model accuracies between conditions. Maybe that's still wrong. I don't know, but yeah.
I would think if you're comparing across the models and you don't care about specific model accuracy, it's probably, I don't know.
Each level of regularization I prefer be preferable for different conditions. That's one of the hardest things to deal with in these kinds of things, is that whatever you choose is introducing some kind of bias. I suppose some people say we use the default parameter, saying that as if that's an unbiased selection, but it's not. You just don't know what your bias is.
So basically, this is like the summary, because it's already 2. This is the summary. Basically, If you care whether your ROI has some information about the conditions, encoding or decoding kind of do the same thing. If your ROI is important for behavior, that's a bit easier with decoding because you're trying to predict, for example, you might be literally trying to predict behavior, like can we decode whether the person can distinguish a cat and a dog. Are some ROIs containing more information about something? Encoding and decoding are the same. If I can't decode cats and dogs in that area, I might claim that there's not a specific type of information there, although that is as problematic as encoding and decoding probably. For model comparison, it is a bit easier with encoding just because you're fitting it on the same data and like it's all it might be difficult with the decoding way to say what exact specific features of the stimuli are driving the classification. Kendrick K says that you can also try to have features that fully describe ROI's activity. So you can only do that with the encoding model. But I guess it is quite difficult, even with like an encoding model in a specific sensory area. So some of the problems with encoding models, I think we've mostly covered them. You need a lot of data, so you often have basically a lot of data from very little subjects. So if you want to do individual differences, that can be difficult. Basically, it is like a normal regression. So if you have something that is correlated with the thing that you're interested in, then the fact that a particular regressor fits or a particular model fits doesn't necessitate that this is actually what is truly represented in the brain. So it is not the case that our brain, for example, has 25 verbs and codes everything like that with these 25 verbs. It's just that this captures something that is related to semantic memory. So therefore, it is a bit difficult when you have 5 sensory motor features to claim that because these features are predicting semantic memory, that it necessitates that the model semantic region is coding for sensory features. Maybe these sensory features are just correlated with something else, like word co-occurrence or like the word embeddings that capture some of the similarity across words in semantic memory. I have always talked here about predicting the raw measures, so the raw fMRI activity, but you can also try to predict the dissimilarity matrices, which basically becomes like RSA, which you then can try to reduce your training data. One of the big problems is you need a viable model. So if you're trying to explain a more complicated cognitive process, then you would need quite complicated cognitive model that can explain it. The response has to be stable, but this is a problem with most models, like pretty much most models. And that's basically going through the same thing, that so just as a regression, if your features are correlated with something, it's not really the case that the feature is predicted. It could be something else. For example, if I try to predict jumping height by like age, it might be the case that that fits perfectly well, but it might be the case that age is correlated with muscular atrophy, and it's not really that age is predicting it, but it's the mechanism is muscular atrophy. And yes, that's pretty much it.
Thank you all for coming, and next week we're back in the meeting house, and Theo is going to be giving us a talk on his work. Thank you again, Peter. Yes.
Thanks a lot for that. It's very useful to have an intro, because